into this group. We also have, again, Aaron supporting us today, and the EQ technical staff, and I see Amy and Mario and Luke all on the line. So the agenda is short, really. It's just simply working through the recommendations. As I highlighted in the email, kudos to Eagle for really spending some concentrated time on that list of recommendations, which will help our discussion along today. But you'll see that a lot of those administrative tasks, I call them, or activities, are kind of collapsed in that spreadsheet. And maybe before we go any further, before I continue, Amy, not to put you on the spot, but I know you were very instrumental in Luke helping and your other staff getting that where it's at. If maybe you wouldn't mind speaking for a moment on just sort of that spreadsheet and where you see your priority for the discussion today.
What we did, I think we kind of teed this up when we had our subgroup meeting before. What we did with the spreadsheet is took out the ones that we knew either needed a legislative or rule change or sort of a policy change that we felt like the task force would want to provide feedback on, and we would benefit from that feedback. The one then on the bottom, what we did is took all sort of the administrative things about how Eagle's organized and supervision and staffing and all those things. And those basically Eagle can do on their own and take the lead on, but we also would love feedback on them if the task force wants to provide feedback on any of them. And a lot of them take staffing or funding for staffing. So what we did on these spreadsheets is along the right-hand side, we tried to estimate the amount of additional work that these activities would take. So you can see, even though we said, well, Eagle can take the lead on these ones down below, you'll see almost all of them are going to take additional staffing. I was telling Evan yesterday, we did all these spreadsheets separately, and when we added it up, it actually got pretty close to, or maybe a little more than what ASDSO said we would need for staffing. So whatever calculations they're using, it's their estimates were pretty good when they talk about what we would need.
Great, thank you, Amy. That's very helpful. And you'll see there, and I think we'll start from the top here, but just you can see the questions there. Amy just highlighted the administrative test a little bit down below there about funding, right? I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of this gets down to having adequate funding to administer the kind of program that you would like to, in the peer review ASDSO report suggests that it should be. So I guess we'll reserve that for a little bit later in the call today. Let me pause just to see if there's any initial questions or comments so far.
One thing I should add too, Mark, what we did on the task force recommendation column is that we tried to put the notes from last time in there, and you'll see actually that there is a overlapping recommendation here that the compliance enforcement and emergency response group already gave their blessing to. That doesn't mean this group shouldn't talk about it too, but I just wanted to mention that. And then this one in green, basically the last discussion we had in this group, everybody felt like that was one that the subgroup could support.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, Amy. Just before we go, is Brian Burrows on the call? I can't. He's not. Okay, he is a member of the group. I thought he'd be joining, but anyway, he may join later.
Quick question.
Yep.
Question for Amy. What if you total up the FTEs? What do you come up with at that?
So additional FTEs, 10.7.
10.7. Okay.
Yep.
That's total, right, Amy, or is that additional?
That's additional.
Okay.
So if you figure right now, we have basically 2 staff plus whatever percentage of Mario in the program. That's why I said we're a little above what ASDSO estimated. But you know, there could be some of these tasks that have enough overlap that you might get down to more like the 11 that they were saying. But I was actually pretty pleased that their estimate was pretty close to ours.
Hey, Amy, I'm curious too. Did you, in your calculation, did you provide any of the distinction in year 1 versus long term, or no?
When I did that 10.7, I did not include any of the ones that said year 1. So we do need to keep that in mind, but I figured we would just eat that in year 1. And it's gonna, you know, this is gonna be a process. It's gonna be phased in. So I wasn't so concerned about the year 1 calculations. I was more concerned about long-term staffing need.
Great, thank you, Amy. Other comments or questions, observations, group members or others?
I guess the one thing I'll ask Amy, maybe this is my interpreting it differently, but the ones that you said Eagle can take the lead on, you know, we don't necessarily need input from this task force. I guess though, we would still be looking for support from the task force for these items, right?
So if you look in, I was thinking about that. So if the task force wants to comment on any of those recommendations, I think that's great. But even if they don't want to get into the weeds there, I have those questions at the top. Does the task force want to have some sort of recommendation about additional funding? Because even if they don't go into the weeds, there needs to be something there, I think, because we won't be able to go to the legislature without support to say we need to so significantly increase our staffing. And then there's some things in this subgroup and maybe a couple others where there's funding needs for like IT development and things like that. And so, you know, does the task force want to have some sort of recommendation to modernize the IT, the information technology part of the dam safety program? So, yeah.
Great, all right.
So if we're talking about 10.7, that's about $1 million, right?
Our latest estimate with when you look at like when we're applying for grants and things, if you put in like overhead, like the buildings and computers and health benefits, I think we're at like 145,000 per person.
145, so it's about 1.45 million. The 10.7, about one and a half million for the 10.7, maybe a little more than that. Okay.
Great, thank you, Amy. Evan, I just saw you strongly supported the first 2 in blue. You want to just?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense in there. I mean, the first one really is 3 different things. The first 2 are kind of no-brainers. It seems like the third one, we probably are going to end up having some discussion about what that means, and we might need to figure out what's our recommendation in that area. You know, allow grant funds be used for program enhancements. But I'm taking that comment to be a little different than the funding comment up above, the revolving loan program, the 3G.
I'm glad you brought that up, Evan. So I actually had to ask Luke about that because in the ASDSO's recommendations, they talk about the fact that when the program, if you remember, the program was almost eliminated, or actually kind of was eliminated, you know, back in the Granholm administration, and due to budget cuts. And when they brought the program back, they ended up using the grant funds that are available for dam safety programs from the feds to basically cover staff. And all, you all the states who have good dam safety programs use that money for training and IT development and things like that instead of funding their staff. So I was asking Luke the other day, like, how much money are we talking about? And it's only like 80,000, 100,000 or something like that. So I think it would be smart for the state to use that as like enhancement money, in the future, 5-10 years from now, be able to use those grant funds for something other than staff. But that's kind of the scoop on that recommendation.
Yeah. And I guess while I'm thinking out loud here, I felt like that second one, a recommendation about tech-related funding, software database development. In my own mind, I wondered if that would be a good place to have kind of a, tap the professional or the private sector and have a little bit of a work group to spend some time discussing that. I feel like that bullet relates to, again, I think 3G, or no, not 3G, but the very first recommendation on our spreadsheet about, having a program focused on risk reduction. It seems to me that bullet is about having a tool to help, a portal as well as a tool where you can slice and dice all the data that comes through the portal as one piece of software. There's a recommendation below in this section, though, that talks a little bit more about technical software. And it would seem like you need to have a real good compass on what does it mean to reduce risk in the program. So I feel like, I know I'm kind of mushing three things together, but I feel like getting some, a little bit of an outside look, I guess, on what risks need to be managed, what risks are really causing the problems, what risks are black swans. I feel like it's having the software, but also designing the program around that whole risk reduction concept. And I have no clue about what software is or isn't available, or if you need 3 packages that talk to each other, but it's some hybrid of, asset management and risk reduction. I saw a reference to ASDSO in the thing up top, but that just a thought to expand on that one. And I'll leave it there and let Mark figure out how and when we start discussing any deeper on that. Again, my thought was you might want to have a work group for 3D, and that really relates to that second bullet in the blue as well, in my mind. I don't know what others think.
Great, thanks. I think that's a good segue. Let's take it from the top, Evan. Thank you. Why don't we start there? As Amy's pointed out, has been adopted by the other subgroup. We want to just spend a little bit of time here from this group's perspective talking about that from where you're sitting.
I actually don't even think this is debatable.
Yeah, so it's a slam dunk. Okay.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay. Thoughts from others? Heads nodding, it looks like.
I agree.
Okay, good. Let's move forward then. The next one, developing a recommendation for a loan program for the rehabilitation of high hazard publicly owned dams. A lot of the discussion yesterday seemed to be focused more on the privately owned ones. And, is there a role for public funding for those privately owned dams? And it didn't seem like there was a big appetite for that. And sort of in another category, we do have, I know the DNR, I think, is probably the largest dam owner in the state. And perhaps that's sort of where this recommendation zeroes in on. Maybe let me first stop for technical staff, Luke or others, anything here that we might benefit from knowing additionally?
Oh, not, I think that most of the state revolving loan programs or even the federal grant programs for rehabilitation versus removal are limited to public entities, or at least they have to have a public sponsor. And that, when we look at the ownership of dams across the nation and echoed in Michigan, it's more like 70%, 60 to 70% of the dams are owned privately. So DNR is the biggest single owner of dams with, 250 some dams or something like that. The other 2,400, the vast majority of those are privately owned. So that's why, I think that any, revolving loan or grant program for funding rehabilitation of a dam is a good effort. I think that if I had any recommendation, it would be that what do we do about private ownership, because it makes up the majority of ownership, whether it is the public's, responsibility to fund that, or whether we look at ownership structure of dams, and the private is the best model. But I think it's something that can't be ignored, because such a big number of dams are privately owned.
And Luke, I'm just curious too, how many of, because I can't remember off the top of my head, how many of the dams are that are privately owned are lake level control structures, whether legal or not?
So there's 350 roughly lake level control structures. Those can be privately owned, but typically they have a public delegated authority, other than a handful of cases. And in a lot of the cases, the delegated authority actually takes over ownership of the dam. In some cases, the actual ownership of the property in the dam is retained by the homeowners association or the property where the dam sits, but there is that other structure through the legal lake level process where the authority over the dam transferred to some public entity typically.
Would that be like a drain commission office or a township then, Luke?
It's like 95% of the time it's a drain commissioner. Sometimes it's a local DPW. The Four Lakes Task Force is a nonprofit that, and in a very few instances it's actually the homeowners association is the delegated authority. But 90 to 95% of the time it's the drain commissioner or the road commission.
And let me just ask you another question. So basically sort of, what I know and historically when DNR has issues with a publicly owned dam, maybe use Shiatown in Owasso, for example, they're just going for a capital outlay, right? They go to the legislature and look for money best they can.
DNR has been pretty successful at obtaining grant money, federal and state grant money for removal. When DNR has a problem dam, like Shiatown, actually that dam was actually not owned by DNR. It's owned by the Michigan Land Bank. It was a tax reversion. But other examples of state-owned dams that had problems, DNR has been pretty successful in obtaining money for removal, and that's just the general case. There's a lot more opportunity for funding for removal. Where we don't have is we're lacking is availability of grant funds for what I'm trying to say, rehabilitation or repair of dams, especially if they're privately owned.
So go ahead, Doug.
I was going to say, this recommendation as it stands is funding for rehabilitation of high hazard publicly owned dams. And I'm wondering, Luke, if you can parse out a little bit how much of the problem is there. You went through a minute ago, the general ownership of dams, but if you look at specifically at high hazard dams that are publicly owned, is that where our problem is to any reasonable extent, or is it elsewhere?
I had to find my unmute button. I switched the views, so the button moved. So I think that it's probably, there's problem children in all areas of ownership, public, state, local municipality and private. Given that the number of privately owned dams is much larger, there's probably a larger number of problem dams, and that a lot of times it's a single property owner trying to fund the operation and maintenance of a dam has got its difficulties, where a municipality has the ability to spread some of that cost over their tax base, which might not be sufficient, but it's something. Legal lake level structures have the ability to spread that across the lakefront property owners, and the state has the ability to leverage state funds and go after grants more readily than a single private owner would. So I would say that I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I would just think by the sheer numbers and the way that ownership works, that probably there's a more of a problem in privately owned dams, you know, or more problems in privately owned dams than public or state-owned dams.
So if I can kind of distill it down here, I mean, this recommendation is all well and good, but this isn't really necessarily where the biggest problem lies. And it'd be good to have something like this, but perhaps there's higher priority dams to focus on.
Risk portfolio would help.
Sorry, what's that, Dan?
You said a risk portfolio would help.
The risk portfolio, like maybe recommendation number 1.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Mark, and Dan brings up a good point. There's nothing wrong with this recommendation other than it's very incomplete. So I think what this group maybe should decide is, do we have another recommendation that talks about also increasing funding and perhaps financing for whatever the risk-based, portfolio spits out to us, or do we change this recommendation to say, let's just look at the risk-based? I think there's pros and cons to having separate bullets to it, and maybe that'd be good discourse. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm gonna, except I think we got to be real careful here, because my assumption would be that any publicly owned dam is serving a public interest, right? DNR dams are serving some measure of public interest. Luke, we're not quite there.
They revert a lot of them, I believe, and so they don't necessarily want them other than they ended up with them.
Yeah.
I think the majority of publicly owned dams serve some public purpose.
And
I think a lot of the publicly owned dams were purchased for $1 back in the 60s. And then, they might not have had a development around the impoundment, and they served a purpose at one point and probably maybe don't now. And so I think that's like Shiatown had a few houses on the impoundment, but it hadn't been a water ski lake since the 60s, It'd been drawn down partially, and those folks still live on the impoundment, but the water was so shallow that nobody could float a boat through there. So I think that it's a mixed bag, but I think you're right. The municipalities probably, or the DNR, built the dam or purchased the dam for a reason. Whether or not that reason still exists is, up in the air.
Yeah. So the point I was going to make is, so we got to parse those apart. So some of those that you might have gotten, DNR may have taken over because they were tax reverted. I mean, that they may not be serving a public purpose anymore. But the privately owned dams, some of those are serving no public purpose. A lot of them are serving no public purpose. And so
most of them are economically failed.
Right. So, I mean, you've got to be, my point is we've got to be careful here in terms of spending public resources for a private purpose, unless we're going to make that money available to take that dam out of there, because I would argue that is a public purpose.
So even though they're privately owned, there's public benefits to be derived by assisting that private owner from removing that structure.
I think that's where we would, I'm comfortable with that. Yeah. I'm not comfortable with, creating a loan program that provides, money for a dam owner that, where there's no public access, no public purpose to it.
Yeah. Sounds like a recommendation.
So that's sort of distilling this down then, Bill. In those cases where dam removal, it might be privately owned, but there is a public interest.
I would argue there is a public interest in helping to get that dam out of there. Yeah. Yes.
So from my point of view, and I am agreeing with Bill, but I just want to reframe it a little bit. If we have a private dam owner who cannot finance their responsibility,
right,
I want to present them a clear choice. Mm-hmm. They either remove the dam or they lose ownership, or I suppose as a third option, but one that I really am not interested in, is that they get help from other stakeholders. If we're going to go that route of help from other stakeholders in maintaining the dam, I'd rather sort of force it to get a lake level control order,
Right.
and then have all of the beneficiaries pay on that basis, and probably, you know, transfer ownership as a part of that.
So Doug, if I may respond, so I've been involved with some, like, Conservation Resource Alliance will help a private owner find public funds to help that private owner remove that dam.
That's okay. It's the maintenance that I'm speaking to.
Yeah, it's the maintenance. Yeah, there's two different things
Gotcha.
here. The removal, I think there's a public interest in that. The maintenance of something for purely private interests is ought to be left to those private interests, although we can help them remove it.
So I'd agree with everything said. I would say that, you know, it comes down to lists of options and resources that the state has available, because of what Doug said and what Bill is saying is if that private entity doesn't have the resources to remove it, or they don't have the resources to repair it, that hazard still sits there, you know. So the state has to have the resources, you know, the staffing resources, the financial resources to implement a solution. We can order removal, we can order drawdown, and that's typically what we do. We can, you know, make them consider the legal lake level route if they want to keep it like Doug has suggested. But a lot of that takes a lot of time and effort because it gets tied up in the court system, because we issue an order, it gets challenged, you know, and then if it comes right down to it, we issue an emergency order. If they don't do anything, we have to have the resources to step in and be able to do something. And that's, you know, if you talk about, you know, a very large dam, you know, that's millions and millions of dollars. So, and it doesn't happen overnight. So I think it's great. I just don't want to get to the place where we don't have some type of thought process in dealing with those challenges of where the private owner doesn't have the resources to do anything, so they do nothing. And then we have to have options from there, whether that's enforcing more drawdowns, enforcing more removals, enforcing more lake levels, whatever it is. Just, I'd like to have a plan for that, you know. That'd be my.
Do you guys think you not have sufficient authority right now to deal with that situation?
I think it's not a question of authority, it's a question of resources, you know.
Okay.
Like I can issue an order to you, Bill, to remove your dam, but if you say no, what am I gonna do, right? It's gonna take me, you know. That's the thing, is the resources.
Mm-hmm.
I think the statute outlines the process. We just, you know, implementing that process is difficult at times.
Sure.
So, and you know, just to follow up, we can discuss, you know, who should be the authority to levy charges to the dam owner. But if you have to step in, I think the costs of doing that should become a claim against the dam owner. And if it bankrupts them, you know, so be it. And then we need to deal with what they can't pay. But otherwise it needs, you know, to either result in them giving up ownership of the dam or paying it.
I think we might have that authority as well under statute. Currently, we have the authority to recoup the cost in a civil action against the owner if the state has to step in. But like, I don't think we have the authority to force them to give up the property. You know what I mean? That type of things. But yeah. So like I said, I think, you know, too, in the interest of time, I don't think we have to solve all the world's problems today, but it seems like this one needs a lot of discussion. So this might be one of those ones where we assign somebody to dig a little deeper and start thinking about it offline. But
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Luke. Amy, or you or other folks, do you happen to know other groups touching in this area? Is there any sort of overlap here that you've seen?
I feel like we're starting to get into the recommendations relative to enforcement. And I don't think those recommendations were saying a whole lot different than what Luke said. It's a matter of resources, and you've only got so much resources and you got to pick your fights. I feel like somehow it's almost a third recommendation. That's great with high hazard publicly owned dams. It's great to have a recommendation about having additional removal fundings for private dams. but I feel like the third one is more in that enforcement area. And do we feel like having a more structured, clear, progressive enforcement method and the new enforcement officers that I think people are generally in favor of, do we feel like that's enough, or do we feel like we need to develop a funding recommendation that addresses this situation? That what I'm hearing both Doug and Luke say is it's an enforcement situation if the private owner doesn't want to remove it and doesn't have money. None of us want to give that private owner money if they're not willing to remove it. Is that true?
Yes.
Yeah. So
I think there's, and I'll double check
like-
here in a minute, but I don't think
Go ahead.
there's another recommendation dealing with the revolving loan. I think this is it. And then I think there's not a recommendation about dam removal. And we've talked about that in some of the other subcommittees. I think that is something that, you know, ASDSO is looking at the dam safety program. How do we make sure dams are safe? So I think either this group or another group needs to look at that. The third, I think it is, Evan, in the compliance and enforcement subgroup. So I think this group could maybe review those and see if there's something related to this funding issue that's not in there. If you remember, there is recommendations from ASDSO about the emergency fund. And one of the things that is very difficult, as Luke was saying, it takes a lot of staff time when we get into an enforcement process, right? It takes all the follow-up, especially when you have someone who's not cooperating at all. That emergency fund would potentially help that process, because we don't have, we don't have extra money that's not for staff, and all the money that we get right now is allocated to other things. So when we have to go and take action ourselves, money is always a problem. So on this current dam failure, we've spent a ton of time trying to figure out how to pay for this emergency work that we're going to be doing. So that is in one of the other ones.
This is Douglas. I don't necessarily mean this comment to be about the current situation where we've got to clean up after an emergency, or after an event, but just point out that constitutionally counties are supposed to approve any dam on navigable waters and have the authorization to collect costs from the dam owner, which I think, myself should be done, via special assessment. And I think we should seriously consider that counties have a role in funding these things. That we should, the dam safety program probably should be in a position to direct a county to do something. But I think it would help us in getting better local engagement in these issues if counties were on the hook for some responsibilities here.
Doug, if I may, just financially, just sort of to be involved, oversight, pulling in a specific direction.
I mean it financially. Just a moment, and I will give you the citation in the Michigan Constitution.
Okay. I see Brian's joined the call. Thank you for being with us today, Brian. I haven't heard from Jim and Brad. Brian, any thoughts from you on this?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I think my thoughts are pretty aligned with what I've been hearing. I can appreciate that this seems to me, at least, to be, pretty linked to the enforcement. And I know that there's a lot of work to be done there, and making a very clear, objective framework for enforcement compliance. But if I'm hearing right, there's still the financial, and I think it interplays back and forth, right? So if there isn't a source of funding, then it feeds back into what can be the subjective nature of our enforcement compliance. I mean, so if you get a bad safety inspection on a high significant and you want to do something quick, but you know that there's no financial means easily available and it could be a contorted process to get them, it may reinforce you being, you know, again, maybe soft and taking a longer route of trying to get the owner to do it. And so I think that they're not trying to cross wires with the enforcement committee, but it seems like that funding piece is an important tool to make sure that we have available.
Yeah. So this is Douglas. Article 7, Section 12 is my reference for the county responsibility and ability to require compensation. And I know, you know, counties might struggle with this, but I do think the path that we should be able to go down here is when there's a need for enforcement, if the owner can't or won't do it, then the state or the county need to be able to step in and do the work and apply a special assessment to the owner for the cost recovery. And then if that results in tax reversion or bankruptcy or whatever, so be it, and we sort it out afterward.
And could you read the section of the Constitution, Douglas, just so that everybody's clear on what it says?
Yeah, it says a navigable stream shall not be bridged or dammed without permission granted by the Board of Supervisors of the county as provided by law, which permission shall be subject to such reasonable compensation and other conditions as may seem best suited to safeguard the rights and interests of the county and political subdivisions therein.
So conceivably, we did this, Evan, you'd end up with the responsibility for assessments. You'd have the ability to assess, create a special assessment for those, you know, property owners on an impoundment of some kind if the dam was failing. That's where you're headed, right, Douglas?
Yes.
I don't know that Evan would, because a drain commissioner is not the county. It's a separate legal entity.
Understood, except it would make sense to me that you'd end up with it because you're the water resources commissioner.
Yeah, okay, right? You understand.
The county would give that responsibility. The county board of supervisors would give that responsibility to you.
They could attempt to, but
in your county,
would not be obligated to accept
county by county.
Yeah, that's true. But I think ultimately you'd still have to have a commissioner who was willing to accept it, because you're going to be pretty unpopular if you're the person going out telling people. I'm not sure what authority you have to initiate a district unless there's an application for 307. That's all.
Yeah.
And you're an elected official, no less, right?
I really like the idea of having the counties more involved in the entire dam safety process. I'm not optimistic that the counties could or want to take on enforcement. It's just I worry about that.
Right.
But
so
I did look at.
To be clear, I'm not recommending they take on enforcement. I'm recommending that they be the financial instrument when enforcement is necessary.
Which is kind of what's happening in Midland, right? I mean, the county authorized that Four Lakes Task Group to form and become a special assessment district for the purposes of.
Yeah, that's kind of where that's heading anyway, Mark, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I did look up in the recommendations, and the only place that a revolving loan program is talked about is in this recommendation.
Yeah, Amy, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting there's a recommendation elsewhere. I'm suggesting we've made up either one or two additional recommendations to supplement this one.
Okay. Jim, were you going to say something previously? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, that's all right. And thank you. Only to suggest, listening along, agree with all of the conversation and the direction that we're headed. I was wondering, is there a precedent and or a story to tell from others' learnings outside of Michigan? Have a successful program or a conversation with anybody who has been through this type of revolving loan program development in the past? Does anybody know that, or would we know that?
Well, Luke, those two buttons on the spreadsheet are links to what Pennsylvania and New Jersey have done, what their programs look like. And we can, through our colleagues in ASDSO, we can request assistance from other states as well. We know all these people pretty well. We see them a few times a year, and we can definitely reach out and get ideas, or even, for the most recent programs that they've been set up for a while, or recently set up, like, what steps were necessary. So we can definitely leverage those resources to help if, a revolving loan program, or I'm not sure if Pennsylvania's is a revolving loan program, but it's something similar. It's a funding mechanism. So I guess once we have recommendations on what the funding mechanisms should look like and who they should cover and things like that, we can reach out and find examples so that we're not reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, we've taken several steps from the development of a revolving loan program as it's written in the recommendation. So whether or not others have had the extended conversation we have, I'm just curious if anybody had a conversation with New Jersey or Pennsylvania in this case.
Not yet, but we can definitely.
And Jim, are you specifically asking though about the county role, or just in general about the recommendations?
Well, yeah, as I was putting the question forth, I was thinking of the county role and where we have taken this. And, again, the recommendation is written, it's pretty vanilla. We've taken it somewhere else. So
yeah.
All together.
Yeah. So maybe we want to have a sideline to sort of do some writing and comparing on between now and the next meeting. I mean, we know we're going to find the other states don't have the drain commissioners, but I have no clue what the county's role would be, because of course, whatever a drain commissioner does here, in some states, it's kind of like it's still a special assessment district with a different legal setups. Sometimes it's not a conservation district like we have here, but like a water district that got set up with farmers years ago, and it appointed a elected person. But at the end of the day, most counties in other states have somebody who's got to deal with water and infrastructure and such like that. So it would make sense that the counties might have more of a role in these other states. It's a good question.
Do we have anybody who might want to hop on the volunteer list there for this one? To review meeting?
Thanks, Aaron. I'm sort of struggling just a bit about next steps, the most logical way forward, and get where we need to go on this one. It's been very good discussion here. It sounds like you say, Aaron, a little side work here.
Yeah, I don't know if everybody wants to or not. I'm happy to. I mean, I've got some thoughts or ideas that I've written down about what additional 2 or 3 ideas there are. I think that we've got, whether they get all mashed into one or sub bullets, whatever. I can certainly send that out, and anybody who wants to respond. I don't think I have everybody's. Oh, I do have everybody's email address for this, Mark, because I think you put us all in the 2 column for this particular group. So I can send that out, and whoever's interested, or if somebody wants to volunteer or has other ideas, it's fine.
See, it makes sense to me what is happening. If we can build on a go forward basis rather than dealing with an emergency, if we can deal on a go forward basis in the way that that Gladwin County stuff is being dealt with. I mean, at the end of the day, what happened? Well, the county gave the authority to somebody to create a special assessment district, right? That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
But do it up front, not when you got an emergency, not when the dam is gone. That makes sense.
Yeah, and I have no
cheaper.
It's a tool in the toolkit. As a practical matter, I've had people try to give me dams before, and You know, I don't want the dam where 2 people have died on the spillway. No, thank you. Nice try. It needs to be.
You don't want the dam, but if the department determines that something has to be done,
yep,
somebody's got to get something done. And it makes sense to me, given the responsibility that is built into the Constitution, that it is the county that says, okay, here's what we're going to do.
So let me just, I know we got to move on here, but so using Midland as an example here then, and we're talking about a revolving loan fund then, are we suggesting then that Four Lakes Task Group would be able to avail themselves to a revolving loan to help address their problems?
No, not unless those dams were owned by a public entity, and they're not.
Okay, so that's the distinction clearly.
Now what they, you know, the county could use its tax authority or whatever other means that could ask for a lake level control order and establish a public entity.
Right.
And then go to a revolving loan fund.
Correct. Exactly.
Okay. We need to move forward. Is there anyone else that would like to do some side work outside of the subgroup here and maybe you know, further refine this recommendation, get to where we need to go?
I can volunteer to help reach out to other states when we're ready to do that, you know, to see what they've got going on. So, but
yeah, and what I'm seeing is, again, sort of the vacuum of these subgroups is that, you know, what the other groups are talking about and sort of a comprehensive request, you know, to the Michigan legislature about what funding's needed on multiple fronts here, right? And I want to be sensitive to how we make this complementary to that bigger request.
Yeah.
At least it seems to me that's where we'd want to end.
Yeah. I have just one last comment about why I'm thinking this county approach. When it comes to the question of whether a dam should be maintained or removed, the advocacy for the dam is almost always local. So, you know, my view here is if the advocacy for the dam is local, then we provide a mechanism by which local advocates can pay for it. Otherwise, it's got to go.
Yep.
Right. Okay, good. Thank you, Douglas. Let's keep moving here then for the time being. The next one, Amy touched on early in the meeting today. And Amy, just to clarify, you or confirm, this was adopted also by the CNE?
No, looking at the notes from this committee meeting, the subgroup meeting, I think your note said that the group adopted it at our last meeting.
Okay.
I think it was the only one this group said, yeah. For sure.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying that for me, Amy. Any just brief comments by subgroup members here or anything further?
Just a quick question to Luke of how big a task is this?
So I think this, you know, Eagle doesn't own any dams, so it's not a big task for me, right? But you know, DNR owns a bunch, so that's a big task. I mean, but this is the way they're working towards it, and we've actually kind of since 2014 been helping DNR get more to a better asset management program. But you know, if they start doing life cycle analyses and things like that, there might be some effort. But they're well headed in this direction to be more of a proactive than reactive agency anyway. So, but Dan turned on his camera. I think he's got something to add.
No, you actually, you covered it really well. They started working through this process, and some of the different regions are maybe a little farther along than others, or different divisions are a little farther along than others in their assessment of their dams, but they're working to holistically throughout the entire division have this assessment done on their dams. And I think, Luke, correct me if I'm wrong, did they just get buy-in or approval from their director and maybe higher up for pushing forward that policy or that program?
I believe it was unanimously supported. I don't know what it takes to be signed and everything, but they are developing a policy on how better to manage their dams because they recognized around 2011 through 14 that they had a couple failures and that they weren't doing as great as managing their own resources as they should be. So they're taking a hard look internally, and it has developed in a lot of steps forward. So I think that this is a no-brainer that the state should lead by example, and they're already well on their way to be doing that. And it probably takes a little bit of refinement and effort, but they're 75% of the way there.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Just a quick comment on this. So it's obviously it's a great recommendation. That's true of any policy that government's going to push. The flip side of this, though, that we might want to consider that might require some legislative action, but I think would only be after talking with those state dam owner agencies. I mean, look at the Transportation Asset Management Council. The state, paid for the development of the tool and the portal that was used, right? We're saying that these agencies are already doing assessment of state-owned dams. On what basis? Because we've got a whole bunch of recommendations that say, we probably need to be assessing these dams a little differently than we are today. So we appear to be headed down a road where those dam owner agencies are going to do what they think makes sense. And then we're going to have a framework that probably looks different than what they chose to do. They may not be doing it the same way even between agencies. We might consider whether or not something in the legislative arena to kind of run that through the Michigan Infrastructure Council or something to have at least not only some uniformity between those agencies, but to also have this sort of be the pilot of whatever tool is chosen, whether it's in the risk-based approach or what have you, for not just being the portal, but also, hosting whatever roll-up data makes sense to go to the state. Am I making sense to people there?
Sure. I would just add, and I don't want to belabor the subject, that we did kind of a portfolio risk assessment for DNR Wildlife Division, that they funded. We did it for them basically, and then they brought their considerations, which are use and wildlife, usage and things like that. So it's maybe not a standard thing that everybody could adopt because they're managing their floodings for a specific purpose, but they are using that as a tool to inform: do we need to sink more money into this? Do we need to get rid of it? And they are removing dams. So I mean, it's been a good tool for them to allocate resources, but it was more this risk-based and use-based analyses of a prioritization tool. So it might not be the model for the state, but we are a little bit down the road on having looked at it more than just using the same tools that we've used for 30 years, to assess these things. So.
Okay, great. Thank you, Luke. All right, I think we'll keep moving on here. Before I do, Evan, I just want to make sure I captured that last comment. So basically you're saying don't do this in a vacuum. Make sure that across the spectrum, the agencies and those that would have some role here for assisting, leading by example would be at the table.
It makes sense. We should think about that. The bottom line, I think what I'm trying to say is, if we're going to say this agency is setting an example, we should probably be prepared for other dam owners to say, well, I want to do what DNR is doing. They've set the example, and is that good or is that not good? I have no clue. So just need to evaluate that. And it includes what you said, Mark.
Okay, thank you.
I would just quickly agree. I won't go into it, but I have an example in the last couple of years of a DNR owned dam. Fish Division owned it. It was on forestry property, had a Parks and Rec development not too far away, and it needed repairs. And they weren't planning for those repair costs, and actually, it was pretty chaotic inside the agency. And basically, other divisions who didn't own it decided that they were going to repair it and retain it. And Fish Division ended up spending its money to repair a dam that was raising water temperature by 5 degrees on a brook trout fishery. And they ended up getting stuck with the bill because they own it. And they weren't planning for it or anything, but it just kind of shows you that it actually is a bit chaotic in that management system.
Sort of where the rubber meets the road, Brian. Okay, thank you. All right, let's move on here. The next one again is about money, like a lot of them it seems. More money, understandably. I guess I'm not going to read it verbatim all. You can all see it, but I think it is helpful if we just pause for a minute and see if any of the technical staff want to weigh in here and provide any additional context or background.
Yeah, I think very briefly, so this one is about using fees, or, so if we set up, application fees or permit registration, like the thing we were talking about in the other group about requiring an ongoing permit or license of a dam, these fees to go into a dam safety emergency fund. So I wholeheartedly support the establishment of a dam safety emergency fund, and however we can get funds into that fund work for me. So, but yeah, I think it would be good if some of those fees could be repurposed, although I would say that application review fees for dam safety are very minimal. So I wouldn't expect that to be anywhere near enough to cover, a multi-million-dollar project if the state had to step in.
I want to echo what you just said. We went through the numbers, and I can't remember how much money you raised each year, but it's minuscule. And taking a portion of that and putting it in an emergency fund is not going to get us very far. It's new revenues that are needed.
Yeah. Just want to raise a question for everybody to think about. It's my assumption at this point that the increased costs of the dam safety program are going to be proposed to be funded with fees on dam owners. We can parse out whether that's, annual fees, inspection fees, whatever. But I think it's going to be a heavy lift to get that much revenue on out of fees on dam owners. And I absolutely agree. We need, as we've been discussing, a way that you can act on an emergency basis. But I'm just wondering if piling that on top of the fee argument is going to be too heavy a lift, so that a different mechanism is needed just for the politics of the situation.
I can chime in a little bit on that. Our programs are not fully supported by fees. That's pretty true across the board. What we've been trying to do, and in a lot of programs, we haven't had fee increases in like 20 years. Mm-hmm. So what we're trying to do, I think, is try to find that balance of making fees more in line with the current costs of our programs and what burden we think is reasonable on someone who's applying. But I think we realize that our programs are not going to be completely fee-based. And a lot of times we talk about that balance of we may be having a permit application fee or other fees through like the dam safety program or other programs, but we also have compliance and enforcement responsibilities. So those are when we try to look at, well, maybe there should be some general fund, because you don't want to put the burden of our compliance and enforcement on the people who are actually trying to comply with the law. So we could look again at that information that Teresa sent us of how much fees actually cover our current dam safety program, but it's a smallish percentage.
And we're talking about increasing it something close to tenfold.
Yeah, we've already gotten approval through the governor's office. We're working on a new position we got approval for a couple of months ago, and then the governor's office already approved 2 more positions. So we're we're not there yet, but we've made some progress in that area already. And I'm not positive, this would be a good question for Teresa, but I think those are all coming out of the general fund.
I mean, it strikes me here a couple of things going on. There's sort of a temporal aspect to this, right? And you're raising an expectation, for example, if this passed, that at some point in the future, you're going to have some sufficient funding. What I'm hearing is it's relatively small, and you may be raising some expectations that can't be met down the road. And I just wondered if there's a need to maybe caveat this recommendation or something else. It sounds good on the surface. It's sort of, you know, in theory, but in application, it's going to take a long time to get the program where you might like it.
Mark, I would think about just canning this recommendation, to be honest with you, because you're not going to get there. There's not going to be enough money. I mean, you put this before the legislature, say, okay, we'll dedicate 10% of the dam of the applications fees to this emergency fund. Well, what does that do? Nothing. But they've fulfilled they've then taken the recommendation and implemented it.
Yeah. Splitting a nickel can't get you to $1.
Say it again.
Splitting a nickel can't get you.
Say it again, Mark.
Yeah, no, Brian was speaking there. Go ahead, Brian.
No, I just said this recommendation is trying to split a nickel to get to $1. And, you know, I think we just got to look at it a little different. You know, I think we should probably, or at some mode, you have to figure out how do we come up with actually all the money for the program staff, current and existing, or current and future, right? Like permit fees aren't going to get us all the way there. So we're probably already going to have to be looking at more and more general fund requests to get to the staffing level desired. That leaves nothing, right, for an emergency fund concept. So it's not even worth that. Now, we should probably talk about how do we get to the emergency fund? What is the right level? Is it a one-time investment that gets reviewed every couple of years? You know, do we need, what is the right amount to request in it? Is it a 5, 10, 15, $20 million to start? And I assume you sort of hope with a one-time initial investment with, you know, some of the other ideas that are circulating about financial liability or financial assurances or insurance plans, that takes the load off the emergency fund. Your ability to recoup things in court, maybe the county-based assessment stuff, maybe that all alleviates the need to, you know, severely dip into the emergency fund and not be able to replenish it. But you know, I'm thinking the emergency fund, you know, don't we have to kind of come up with an amount, ask for a one-time investment, probably from the general fund, and then have some plans to recoup it as it's used, recover it. But, you know, who knows? Does it last 5 years? Does it last 10 years? You know,
So let's just talk this through a little bit further. The idea of an emergency fund is that it's ready money for the dam safety program to tap to get something done that the owner fails to do. And it raises the problem of how much money and then how do you sustain that over time? And I'm wondering if we shouldn't be looking for a mechanism where, you know, it's not an infinite amount, but essentially unlimited funds are available to do these emergency things, and paying for that is done initially by charging it to the dam owner and then having, you know, the taxation methods and so on that we were talking about earlier as the way to recoup that. And if it takes them to bankruptcy, then we need a fix after that. But just rather than thinking we're going to keep a pot of money sitting around for these emergency purposes, I'm wondering if it shouldn't be authority to spend and then compel the repayment.
So I'm curious about what if, so I mean, we're talking about, I guess you guys yesterday had, I think, approved a recommendation for, you know, basically licensure, or you'd recommend something for licensure of the dams, you know, and there's some, I'm assuming with that, there's some annual fee tied to that.
Mhm.
You know, that basically could be a funding source. And I mean, probably the biggest question is, you know, what do we feel is a reasonable fee, you know, each year for that licensure? But, you know, with that, you know, ideally, if you set those amounts such that it's a reasonable amount to, you know, fill the coffers basically for this emergency fund over some duration, there is kind of a finite limit to how much we would reasonably need in any given year for emergency actions. And like you said, Brian, you know, there are cost recovery methods we're going to be going for after the fact, and other things like that to try and replenish that fund. After that fund is full, you know, we also are talking about other grant programs or loan programs, you know, basically then to incentivize owners, you know, who are keeping their dams, you know, once we reach that level where we've filled up the coffers for the emergency fund, now that money starts getting diverted over to a grant program. And now it's money that's available for these owners to reinvest into their dams to keep them safe, or pay for removing them if they don't want them. Things like that, but it's coming out of a fund that they're providing.
Bill, amongst us, you're probably most knowledgeable on this. I'm wondering if we should be thinking of this as a dam emergency fund, or if we shouldn't create an ability for the director or the governor to declare an emergency, you know, in relation to a dam, and tap some, you know, larger state emergency fund that would be effectively infinite with respect to the costs of emergency repairs of a dam.
You're muted, Bill.
You're muted, Bill.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I was going to say, if you created a line item and funded it with general fund at $100,000, okay, just some number, just pick a number, $50,000, $100,000, $200,000. Create a line item in the dam safe, giving them the authorization to do that. Once you've got the line item, the director can then move funds around within the department with the approval of the governor to expand that, to deal with a real emergency. That happens all the time across state government. That's how it's done. So, you know, that's an option. That's another option. Just create the line item and then leave it there at some. How much do you guys need a year, do you think? Dan, you said you don't think you need much. What do you need?
I mean, my thought is probably more so on the line of, you know, a couple million, but that's something I think ASDSO has actually made recommendations, you know, given our portfolio of a number, and we could dig into that.
Well, my point is you can get there and expend the money without having it, and then tap into, as Douglas said, tap into some other funds. The governor might declare an emergency if you had one.
Can you declare an emergency before the catastrophe?
That's I was just thinking about that. That's a problem. Yeah.
Well, but that can be fixed as a matter of law. That authorization to declare an emergency because of a pending event that you can address, right?
Yeah, that's
Except for current politics with the
So I actually have a question for Luke. And then I want to chime in about cost recovery a little bit. In my experience in our programs, we have not always been successful with cost recovery. In fact, a lot of times we're not. So I don't want to be a downer, but that is kind of the case. And I don't know specifically in the program, Luke, how we've done in the dam safety program, but across the board, we haven't been super successful. And the other thing is, in this current situation that we have, when the director was looking for potential funds, there just so much of the department's budget covers staff that there's really not an ability to like move money around. So having a pot to start with, at least. We could talk about like how does the pot get replenished, but having a pot to begin with, I think would have really helped us this time around. It would have really expedited our ability to take action.
Because I think whatever our recommendation is, there needs to be narrative that starts off with that. I feel like we're not trying to set up a 401k. We're trying to set up an emergency fund to deal with what's right in front of us. We're not going to replace, these dams. And I think referencing the Midland example, I'm not sure if we would run into something that has a higher profile or a higher impact. So it's an easy example to say. And back to what Dan said, though, if ASDSO has recommended a daily amount, that would be good information for us to have as we talk about this. Last thought, I totally agree that garnishing either fees or even licensing fees or permit fees probably doesn't work. Pennsylvania did theirs based on gas and oil tax. I think that opportunity is behind us with Prop 1, but I don't know that we need to identify how it's going to happen. I think we need to identify what the need is, and maybe it does make sense to say, look, so what if it's a tough legislative environment? Hey, this kind of legislation would be good. Otherwise, you guys need to plunk 50 million in there. Regardless, whatever our recommendation is going to get changed. And it would be great to point to our recommendation the next time this disaster happens. Whether the legislature wants to fund it in 1 year or 15 years is kind of their choice, and they're going to make that choice anyways.
Yeah.
Amy and Fox. Go ahead.
No, you go.
Amy, you said that the record on cost recovery wasn't good, and I just wanted clarity from you. Are you talking about through civil action specifically?
About the issue, and so many entities are limited liability companies right now, and that really complicates things. And in certain cases, things go bankrupt before it's not that we made someone go bankrupt because of our cost recovery. It's they went bankrupt, so there is no cost recovery.
Yes, it's part of our grand scheme for socializing costs. So yeah, I get it, right. But that's one of the reasons I keep pointing to special assessment on property. That seems to me to be the least exposed to that kind of thing, because that assessment against the property can survive the changes in legal structure, bankruptcy, and things like that, to some degree, more than anything else that I can think of.
Not to beat a dead horse either, but and take up too much time, but I just wanted to echo what Amy had said about and maybe bring up another. Sorry, we got a 2-year-old in here with me. Hold on a second.
It's okay. It's an improvement.
Singing us a song. So but I think that our vision and our past is a little bit skewed because we haven't had the resources or funding mechanism to go after these large removals, repairs, whatever it may be, without basically just using up all the time and resources that we have in the department. So we kind of go after the low-hanging fruit a little bit of where you can completely drain a reservoir. What that doesn't cost very much to open gates and pull logs out and drain it. And that a lot of times that gets to the risk reduction that we need to see to avoid a dam safety emergency. So on a given year, we might not spend much money because we don't have the resources to be proactive, right? We're very reactive when it's a true emergency. We're looking at what we can realistically pull off, and if you want to use the case of Edenville, not to get into it, the only real risk reduction there is multi-millions of dollars and several years of planning. You know what I mean? There was no easy button. So that's what I'm saying is if we want to prepare for that scenario, the dam that's going to cost us millions of dollars to address, we have to have a lot of money in a fund somewhere, or access to a lot of money in a fund somewhere. And cost recovery, like Amy had said, you know, when we got bankruptcy and LLCs becomes difficult, but we haven't pursued a lot of cost recovery more than the thousands of dollars, you know, that it took us. I'm thinking Corunna, we did an emergency order with a drawdown in Corunna, recouped about $11,000 from the city of Corunna to enact that, but that's small potatoes, and it only took a week, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking multi-million-dollar project that takes months of engineering, we're finding out that that's very difficult to pull off, and we're doing it expecting that we're probably not going to get any cost recovery. So that's the thing that I would say is that, you know, we're going into an uncharted world here in Michigan a little bit in the dam safety program, because we want to expand to be able to do these big things, but those big things cost a lot of money with maybe limited ability to cost recover. So unless we have something that puts that money in an account from the dam owners ahead of time, we're doing it out of state funds and trying to recoup it after the fact, which may have limited success.
Luke,
Yeah,
thanks
so-
for that. I just want to be mindful of our time here. We're closing in on the end. Brian, if you want to make one final comment, and start to wrap up here and talk about next steps.
Yeah, I just, I think on this one, this has helped give me clarity, and for Luke's benefit, you know, the way I was thinking about an emergency fund is not like the big giant price tag to repair, say like the Edenville dams to good standards. I would have thought it as, hey, if you think that thing needs to be drawn down until those bigger repairs are done, but you found out drawing it down, hey, there's a bunch of weird sediments, it's actually going to maybe take us $300,000 to try to do some sediment work as part of the drawdown. I would want that fund there for you, so you knew you could take that immediate safety step. Not necessarily, I wasn't necessarily thinking about having it large enough to pay for the kind of long-term fix. But I still think, you know, as far as the emergency fund goes, I think we're best to be thinking, you know, general fund, because I was just trying to do a napkin calculation with the staffing. If we have 2,000 dams that we license and we charged everybody $500 license fee, that would get us about $100,000 or $1 million. And that would be what, probably 7 or 8 of the 11 staff people that we've contemplated being ideal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of, yeah.
I don't see any which way that permit fees are ever going to be high enough to really even get us. We should try to make sure that they're a meaningful contribution to the staffing, but I just never see it as something that'll be enough for the emergency fund.
Yeah, so I've heard everything here, and just to try and wrap this up for today, from you know, a recommendation to delete it and think a little bit bigger, or how this can be woven into some of the other money discussions that are happening. To it's okay if we kind of refine it, caveat it, and I'm thinking even putting an amount in here. It's nice to have a target, right? What a capitalization figure might be out of the gate. Put some bounds around just what we're talking about. And I wonder if we want to have a couple folks here again between now and the next meeting, spend a little more time thinking this through, whether it's revising it. Go ahead, Doug.
I was going to say, I think we have a consensus on one point, which might help with what you're trying to do, and that is that whatever this fund is, we should not try to finance it off of the permit application fees.
Right.
So I think maybe you can take that off the table, and then the assignment is to think about what the funding mechanism is for emergency response.
Are there a couple folks that want to spend a little time thinking about that I might be able to engage between now and a week from today? Bring something back?
I signed up yesterday for about as much work as I'm going to be able to do. So,
Brian, you look like your body language is you'd be agreeable for that.
I would. I'm not sure if I have any sophisticated, complicated things, but I could at least put something basic.
But I wonder, you know, maybe with Luke's input and others on his team, giving some thought to this and hearing today's discussion, they might have some thoughts as well. Jim, Brad, any thoughts from you?
No, and all of this, my apologies. I have been paying attention tentatively to the discussions today, and I've been following along fine. But I agree, there's no way permit fees are going to be appropriate here. Brian, if you want some help, I could get together with you probably next week and have a chat about this and bounce some ideas off. The one thing that's been sticking with me is how or if it gets replenished. So I agree, it's got to be an emergency. It's not we're going to do a big project with this. It's going to be we're going to address something, we're going to make it safe. But depending on who that was for, if it was on behalf of a private owner, I really want to know how we're going to be able to recoup that. And that kind of gets back into the whole enforcement discussion and resource discussion. So I don't have a lot of specifics in mind right now, Brian, but if you want some help, I'd be happy to collaborate.
Brian, I really liked the way you put it when you said that, look, we want to limit the use of that emergency fund to deal with the public safety emergency. We're not in the business of correcting an overall problem. So you're right. I think the main purpose should be the drawdown, so that other activities paid for by the private owner can take place.
I just chime in too and say, I think we really need to get an amount and agree on an amount. That's the most important part.
Right.
I feel like the how part, you know, how do we decide that? I feel like we should just provide in the report. I put this in the chat. What are the other states doing? ASDSO recommended you need more money. Surely there's a resource. I'd like to know by next meeting, what are the other states doing? And maybe we just leave it at that. I mean, there's a million ways you can come up with the amount of money we're talking about.
And that's not our purpose for this group, right? Those conversations are going to happen as we get further down the road when our work is done, Evan. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up and try and make a hard stop at 2 p.m. today. Excellent discussion. I'll work with those folks that have signed up here and just make sure that we're going to have those conversations and bring something back next week. Also, I would urge you all to take a look at that list down below that we started the meeting off talking about, and Amy gave some background on, because I don't, want to just take those off the table here. If there's anything in particular you want to talk about, or some things get priority over others, if that's warranted or not, but give those activities some thought between now and next week. And I think we're in pretty good shape moving through these. So I'll pause there. Any final comments from, first of all, Eagle staff?
Mark, I don't know if
Go ahead, Bill.
did you want to,
I'm sorry?
I was going to say, the 2020-07-I recommendation there on civil service, I dropped that one. We're not going to have any influence over civil service and compensation.
Yeah, or that would almost fall, down below with the others too.
It would fall. It should fall down below.
Yeah,
Yes.
on the purview of this discussion, perhaps.
Right.
The only thing I'll say about that is we have not been able to convince civil service to have compensation rates high enough for engineers that we can actually hire good engineers. A lot of times when we post engineering positions, we get very few applicants with very little experience.
Okay. Well, then we could say that much.
Yeah, I'm not sure you're going to convince civil service
I'm not sure we are
either, but I think the governor maybe could, and this is a report to her that, hey, you got a big problem here. You need really good engineers in your dam safety program, and you can't hardly hire them. Thank goodness we have Luke and Dan. That's all I can say.
Okay. Thank you for that. I really need, I've got a hard stop myself. I apologize for that, but and being respectful of others' time. This has been very good. Amy, thanks for that last point. Give it some additional thought here. I think it's an excellent point you make. And so if there's some way we can acknowledge that or make sure that it's not lost in the conversation, we'll want to do that. So with that, thank you all again for your time today. Another excellent discussion. It's amazing, 90 minutes goes this fast. So I think that's a good thing. That means we're making progress and people are engaged here. Thank you for that and your attention. And of course, Eagle staff and Aaron, thank you. And with that, I think we'll adjourn and be in touch. So.
Yep, and this will be sent out to the group. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Everyone stay safe.
Thanks, all.
All right. Thank you.
Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.